Thank you. Thank you for inviting us to be here. This is so fun. When I heard Pop-Up Festival, I got very excited. This is a very fun experience for me personally, and I'm going to get right to it because we only have an hour, and I want to introduce you to Melanie Abrams. And the reason why I'm saying it that way is because she is the talent in the room. I am the wonk. I work in the industry, which means that I make a career out of capitalizing on the talents of people like Melanie. I was a longtime book editor in the industry, and recently made what we call the big switch to agenting. I'm now a literary agent representing authors and advocating for them in the marketplace. But the reality is that I only do what I do because of genius minds like Melanie, who write the stories that change our lives and affect us in really deep ways. So thank you to Melanie for your talents and sharing them with the world. And let me talk a little bit about Melanie to all of you. I promise you, we are not going to give away what happens in her book. It's just not going to happen where there are no spoilers. There shall not be spoilers today. Quel horror. But I do want to tell you a little bit about her book, which came out on May 1st. And as you know, having a book come out is a very big deal. It's like having a baby. Congratulations on your book, baby, Melanie. It is called Meadowlark. It is phenomenal. And I'm trying to figure out how to see all of you at the same time. I'm trying to put this on like some sort of like view where I can see all your beautiful faces. Speaker view is not what I want. Here we go. Melanie's book, Meadowlark. Here's just a quick bit about what's so phenomenal about it. The book is about two main primary characters who, Simone and Aaron. Simone and Aaron grew up in a very austere, cult-like community, and they eventually escape, good for them, and go their different ways, only to reignite their connection years later in a moment where one of them needs something the other one can possibly provide, and they have to go through their own grappling experience of how much do they put their own lives online for loyalty, for love, for their own identity and what they stand for. And all of this comes out in the experience of these characters throughout her beautiful book. And Melanie is a phenomenal writer. If you have not read the book yet, please go pull up a different window in your computer screen and go order it right now, because it is the reason why we read is for books like this. So Melanie, what a joy to talk to you about your beautiful book. How does it feel to have a book out in the world, fresh and debut and in the hands of readers?
Well, first I have to say also that this is a particular treat for Laura and I, because Laura is super intimately acquainted with this book before it even came out. She was incredibly helpful. In fact, she has the longest acknowledgement in the acknowledgement section. So this book would be a very different book without Laura. But it feels pretty good and weird. I mean, we're in a pandemic and things have shifted significantly. So everyone who has a book coming out now, all these online class events have been canceled, and the news cycle doesn't have a lot of space for all info about books and all the things that we want to talk about. But on the other hand, people have really like banded together, and there's been all kinds of new opportunities like this to get the word out there and talk about books. So good and not so good, but let's go with the good. We'll stick with the good.
Good. I'm loving this online format, honestly.
Yeah.
And the first thing I want to say, and I have been very lucky, not as Melanie's official editor and not as her agent. I have been able to witness Melanie's evolution of writing this book draft through the few drafts that she wrote, and to see up close how she perfected the story that needed to be told, which is actually incredibly, what's the word? It's almost a little precocious in how much she is speaking to the world we're living in right now. How much control do we have over our environments is a big theme in the book. But I'll start actually by saying, given the date, Melanie, happy Mother's Day.
Thank you.
It occurs to me that we very well could have conducted a very lively conversation about explosive plots in literary fiction about motherhood. Full stop. I think that a lot of us have something to say about the explosive experience of raising other humans. Alas, that is not our topic today. We're just talking about explosive plots in literary fiction. And I'm going to throw a question at you to start. And I'm going to throw a question at you that is not just a question, but it comes with a deadline, because it's a very big question. Very big question, and I want you to answer it as quickly as you can. Otherwise, we will spend 6 hours just on this. When we talk about literary fiction, what does that mean to you and you alone? Because there are for all of us, literary fiction means something a little different. It could mean something with a highbrow sensibility, with an erudite tone. It could mean something like a very specific, nuanced attention to how we use language to tell a story. It could just mean a certain category on a bookshelf in a bookstore. What does it mean to you to write literary fiction?
Yeah. I teach at UC Berkeley as well. And this is one of the very first things that we talk about, because a lot of times students come in wanting to write all kinds of things. And when my class is usually focused on literary fictions. We have to talk about what the differences are between literary fiction and genre fiction. So for me, literary fiction is usually character driven. So everything that happens is arising from the interiority of a character. Whatever is driving them is coming from inside. And usually the opposite is what happens in genre fiction. It's plot driven, so that we're interested in what happens and how it happens, but not necessarily why it happens, because the why is what's happening inside the character and like how they make sense of it. So that's usually how I differentiate. Character driven is literary fiction, plot driven is genre fiction. However, I will say that and that's one of the books, the kinds of books that I love to read are hopefully the kind of book that I wrote and have written. And that is this kind of page turny story, but really rooted in character. And so that idea that there's just literary fiction, just genre fiction, I think we can all agree the two are getting closer and closer and closer together and melding in lots of ways. And I think that's probably some of the stuff that we'll talk about now. So that was the brief analysis.
Because we could talk for hours about what is literary fiction versus not literary fiction. And we could have a few good lively arguments. I'm sure if we got 6 people in a room, we'd have 12 perspectives. But that lands with me. I think that we can all kind of agree to some extent that literary fiction has, like you said, something to do with the interiority, the inside, the brain, the heart of the characters and what motivates them. And that kind of, I think, is an excellent segue into the second part of the topic of our discussion today about explosive plots. And I want to tell a little story. I don't know if you'll remember this. I think you might. But one day, Melanie and I were at a party with a lot of literary folk. It was a party with writers and editors and fiction writers. And I'm talking to one person and Melanie was talking to somebody else. And I hear out of the corner of my ear, if that's an expression, "Hey, Melanie, what's your book about?" And I hear Melanie tell this person what her book is about. And I had to say to the person I was talking, "Excuse me for just a moment." And I walked over to where Melanie was with her chatty partner. And I said, everything that Melanie just said is absolutely true and accurate, that it does happen in her book. But the elements that she chose to describe her book were all the most explosive moments. They were not about the interiority. They were not about the thinky heart and soul of the characters and what motivated them. It was about the boom and the bang and the big explosive moments in the plot line. And I thought that was really fascinating, that your immediate instinct when describing a book was to go to the most dramatic moments of all and to cherry pick them as representing what the book is about. Whereas for me, a lot of what makes your book absolutely gorgeous are the quieter, more inside the heart and soul of the characters. So when you chose the topic, because Melanie chose the topic of this discussion, I said, you choose, I'll show up. Whatever you want is good. When you chose this topic of explosive moments, explosive plots in fiction, and we don't really think of literary fiction as explosive, what is it about that explosive component of a story that excites you? When I think of explosive, I think of movies that are like blockbuster dude movies with car chases and bombs going off and guns. And it's not to say that your story doesn't have those big moments, but what is it about you're about writing those big moments that calls to you as necessary?
Yeah, such a good question. And I actually, to front load it, remember what my little elevator pitch was from that night. And then I can't repeat what the better one, which was what Laura said, but it used to be photojournalist goes to infiltrates a cult, and there's something about a Waco-like standoff. And then Laura was like, wait a second, that is all accurate. There are two cults in this book. A photojournalist does go inside, but it's, like Laura said, deeper or more layered than that. So what calls me about the explosive plot part of it? I think that what happens a lot with writers, and it actually might come from teaching so much too, is that what I see a lot, especially with young writers, is that most of the people who come to writing, especially fiction, they come because they're interested in the human condition. They're interested in this internal experience. And so most writers come with an ability to convey that onto the page, and have us understand what is going on inside someone. But what they don't necessarily recognize in their early stages of writing is that is fascinating, but there also needs to be the story that that takes that piece along with it, so that we are compelled to keep reading. And I think that what happens a lot, especially when we're talking about literary fiction, is that we forget that writers are first and foremost like storytellers, and also that our job is to like give pleasure and to tell, to provide a narrative. And so I think that has always been super important for me to make sure is at the forefront. It's almost as if, yeah, the understanding is that all the character stuff will be there. Of course, it'll all be there, but it'll also have this. And that's the thing that I think a lot of literary fiction doesn't necessarily have, or is afraid of, is that going in the latching onto story and allowing story to take the reader through, not just like interiority.
So when we as readers think about literary fiction being maybe a little quieter than, I don't know, another genre like commercial fiction or genre fiction or mysteries or something where it wears its drama on its sleeve, how do you as a writer telling the story you want to tell? And again, just for readers, I'm not giving anything away. This is not a spoiler for the people who are tuning in today. The story here is about two characters who grow up in a place where they feel overly controlled. They go off into the world. They go their own ways. At some point later, they're reunited through circumstances, and they have to either show up for each other or not show up for each other in a very palpable way. And yes, there is a police raid involved. And yes, there is a gun that we see in the first act that might go up in the third. I'm just saying, read the book, you'll get to know what happens. But there are these moments of intensity that aren't quiet. Why do we think of literary fiction as quiet when truly our most interior experiences are the most explosive of all?
Right. Such a good question. I mean, in a way, like oftentimes I'll come back to craft. And so in this situation, I feel like I'm coming back to craft, and this idea of conflict, because all fiction is at the heart of it, hopefully, is conflict, crisis resolution. And how do you make conflict? You have your protagonist want something, and you put the obstacles in the way of them getting it. And the story is your protagonist trying to get what they want, running up against obstacle after obstacle after obstacle until they either get what they want or they don't get what they want. And so I think with literary fiction, it's been that we see a lot of that internally. Like, for example, a woman wants to come to terms with her, the trauma of being raised without a father, right? That's a very internal experience. And so she spends the book trying to like get over that, or looking for men to heal that wound, or maybe looking for her father to find out why he left. And those are like more internal moments. But I think that with the kind of fiction that I tend to like reading is that you have that internal conflict, but you also definitely have the external as well. And that is what's driving the narrative. So for example, in like Meadowlark, there's really three different points of view. So if we're just talking about Simran, who you guys know, Simone/Simran, she has a lot of people have two names in this book because they grew up in this Eastern-leaning commune where they were given one name, then they went out into the real world and took another name. So Simran is what she wants is to go visit this childhood friend and take photos to show the world. So she has something external to do, and the stakes are high for that too. The reason why she wants to take these photos and show the world these photos is because the cult, or the commune, is at risk of being decimated by the police, and so the stakes are high for the external conflict, as well as the stakes are high for the internal conflict. She's also trying to reconnect with her childhood friend also. So you have both of those paralleling and moving forward at the same time. And I think that's how you build really strong literary fiction that hasn't that explosive plot.
I really don't know, Melanie, if a lot of the people who are here today identify as writers, readers, or both. It would be so interesting to know. So I'm going to assume that everyone who's here is at least a reader. If they're not, maybe you're writers, maybe you're not, but you're definitely a reader if you're here. And I think that for readers, one of the reasons why we read is absolutely because we live literary fiction in our own real lives. We have these deep feelings inside of us. Our brains are going as we think, and our bodies are moving as we act. And literary fiction is what brings forward that kind of an experience on a page, so we can experience it out of body a little bit and maybe grapple with what we're doing in our own lives on a page. And that brings me to this word, explosive. And I'm so curious why you chose that particular word. I think I said earlier today in this conversation, explosive does make me think of like the ook dude movies with the car chases and the explosions at the bank when they're robbing the vault and all that kind of stuff. But there's one other thing that comes to mind when I hear the word explosive. And when we just let everything go, some of that is intellectual, but some of that is physical. And I wonder if you can talk to us a little bit about this building up of a combustible tension and then letting it go in some way, and how you keep that in mind as you are writing and ratcheting up the tension of a story, and then ultimately coming to a point of, if you'll allow me, climax.
Right.
And a satisfaction afterward, either for the character or for the reader or both.
Right. I think that part of it is, when you're starting to write a book, you obviously have so much to figure out: who your people are, what are they doing, what do they want, et cetera, et cetera. But the other thing you have to figure out is where you're going to start the story. Because I always there's this Janet Burroway, she's a great, she writes a lot about how to write fiction. And she talks about, with your story, you can start with the great grandparents coming over on the Mayflower, or you can start right next to where the climax moment, and you have to figure out between that climax moment and this Mayflower, where are you starting? So I've always liked this idea of starting as close to the climax as possible. And I think there's something attractive to me as a writer about that kind of energy that exists when something is going to be fundamentally different from this moment on out. And so if you start close to that moment, you already are starting with this kind of explosive energy. And that's always been interesting to me, rather than building slowly up until this moment. In fact, this book takes place, the early piece of it, there's like a week that goes by, but when the action really starts going, it's like 2 days. And so I really just have always been fascinated and attracted to those plots that are just so compressed in time and space. Because in space too, it's all on the commune that this is happening. So yeah, so it doesn't quite touch on the explosive piece of it. And I would say what's kind of, ask me another question if it's not, if you think I can. Yeah.
Well, I want to ask this question. I'm so interested. I don't know if our audience, if you have a child under the age of appropriate adulthood watching this video, please send up a flare, put something in the chat, and I'll keep it super G-rated as best I can. But I'd really love to hear from you. when we talk about explosive plots, whether it's in literary fiction or even literary film or any kind of storytelling, we talk a lot about how sex sells, and that makes it sound very tinselly and very superficial and very pandering to an audience. But I want to like reclaim that for a second. I want to rein it in and ask you, as a storyteller, how important do you feel it is for a story about the experience of being an adult to touch on the topic of sex?
Right.
It's not a big theme in your book, but it does come up. And I can't help it, but when I see a topic of a discussion like this one that's so fun about explosive plots in literary fiction, which again, we're going to go back to, literary fiction represents storylines that speak to the inner experience of living in this world. How important is it to talk about sex? How important is it to hit that mark of the utmost connection of intimacy in a way that is either satisfying or not, as the case may be, given as one might be? Talk to me a little bit about how important it is to include intimacy and sex in a storyline.
Right. I mean, one of my favorite quotes is, I'm 99% sure it's George Orwell, who said that literature should take place in the gutter, which I kind of like. I mean, I've always been attracted to more edgy topics. I mean, this book happens to be about, have this commune/cult aspect to it, which is, everyone like, ooh, and interested in, and it's, in, especially now, like part of the zeitgeist, and there's a lot of, interest in that. But I also, like, my book that I wrote before this is basically all about sex. I mean, if you all just Google and look at the cover, you'll immediately know what I'm talking about. What?
Book. Melanie's talking about not this particular book, but her last, but this is her second novel.
Yeah.
And her first novel, why don't you talk about it just a little bit? And there is quite a theme that runs through it. I would not say the book is about sex, but I don't think you could tell the story without it.
Absolutely.
Playing.
Well, that's actually great to come back to this idea of, like, how does sex work? I mean, I think that we're all sexual beings. So anytime that there's any kind of sexuality or intimacy, we tend to be like, ooh, I want to read that. I mean, I can't tell you how many times people have looked at the cover of my first book and said, oh, I want to read that. Or even like, oh, I want to read that, but I don't want you to know I'm reading that. So I think that, yeah, right. It has that, like, titillation, but I think that this idea that not being gratuitous, like, it's not just of titillating, that it, again, coming back to this idea that it has to drive the character. So, for example, that book has lots of sex in it, but the reason it's there is to drive the main character to try and get what she wants, right? Coming back to conflict again, you have somebody who wants something and something very big at stake, and they spend the story trying to get that because it's so important to them. And if you have sex in a book, it has to somehow be part of that internal experience for it to work on the page, because otherwise then it just does become gratuitous and kind of like erotica, which I'm all for erotica, but you can't write erotica and call it literary fiction. Like, it has to be coming from a place that is really, really fundamental to the storytelling itself. So that's kind of a little bit about sex. Yeah.
So interesting. I can't help but think, as you're talking about storytelling and sex, that there's a heightening and an intensifying of tension, and dialing it up until there's a moment where we reach a climax, a crescendo. I think there's really a fair comparison right there. And I'm looking also at the same time at these comments and questions we have along the side here. And I have two questions right in front of me. How do you increase the tension? How do you dial it up and get the reader invested in those moments of intensifying and tightening those dials and turns until you reach just that perfect moment of letting it loose? What is that like for you as a writer? You're the one in control of the storytelling, and you're the one who decides when to ratchet the tension and when to let it free. How do you know when that exact moment comes?
Such a good question. And I mean, natural talent? No. But also, I do think that, like, as a writer, we live so much inside our worlds and inside our books that actually piece that Laura's talking about now is something that I have, like, not struggled with, but that have often needed other readers to come in and look at the whole and say, this is what is lacking or not lacking, or this is where you need to ratchet that tension up. Because when you're existing in your book and you're existing in these characters, every moment feels so fundamentally important that it often, I think, does require a different reader to be able to look down at the whole and see how it's working and saying, here's where you want to focus more. So, I mean, super unfulfilling answer to that question. I'm basically just saying I need people to help me.
Oh, interesting. That's so interesting. I mean, what I think is also, and maybe you can speak to this, is the craftsman here.
Yeah.
That when we talk about sex sells in a tensely superficial commercial kind of way, what that's speaking to is this idea that a lot of storytelling capitalizes on sex just to sell something, and it in a really not thoughtful way, whether it's like writing sex as like a rape scene. We've been hearing a lot of pushback, thank goodness, about Hollywood in particular, but also in books. Can't you tell a dramatic story without raping a woman? I mean, that's not necessary. Where do we change that narrative? Where do we create storylines that allow us to reach the topics of intimacy and interiority and the lives we live with inside of us, and how they get displayed on the outside of the way we live, sometimes through sex and sometimes through other ways, without pandering to the masses?
Right.
How did you process that as you were writing a story?
Yeah. I mean, I think that has always been fascinating to me. And by that, what I mean is nuance and shades of gray. I mean, it's super easy to say cults are bad. But I love this. Julia Shears interviewed, she has a whole book on Jonestown. And one of the quotes that one of the survivors of Jonestown said to her is like, nobody joins a cult. You know, they join an intentional community, or they join this. And so for me, it's all like, I'm going to get back to the sex piece in a second, but it's always been, when I talk about Meadowlark, problematic for me to label either of these places cults, because it's so just black and white. There's no nuance there. So I struggled a lot with the language. What are we going to call this for publicity and marketing? Is it an intentional community? Is it a commune? Is it a cult? And what I'm most interested in is that nuance of being like, yes, something can be bad, but it can also be good. And so with sex, especially with the first book, I really, really thought about a lot, because there is, there's this whole BDSM theme in there, and, she gets hurt and she wants to be hurt. And from a very black and white perspective, we're going to say, oh, woman being hurt by a man equals bad. And I think that that's just so dismissive of the human experience in a way, and that something can be revelatory, or it can also be, or it can be all these things at the same time. And so for me, anytime there is like any kind of violence or sex or anything that, or I say it's the gutter, it's super important to me that we're looking at it in a nuanced kind of way. And that's also why, like, the commune leader in Meadowlark, I hope, is super nuanced. Like, he's this charismatic leader who is really driving this community that he's created into the ground, but he's also able to be to have that charisma and that love and the bigger vision, and be able to look at you and see you completely. And so there's this nuanced kind of feeling to it that I think is life. And so just kind of mirror that is what I hope to be able to do.
I mean, you did a beautiful job in the prose. And what I can't help thinking about is, as we live in this world, I'm just going to take this out of the bedroom for 1 minute and into the wider world. We can go back there if you want to anytime. But something that I think about in a wider sense, especially in this moment in time of history, is this idea of control. We live in an era where control is both very high in terms I can control my world by saying stay home all the time. I can control my world by having chemicals in every room that will disinfect every little corner of my house if I choose to. I can control how I experience the outer world outside of my front door by deciding when and how I'm going to engage with it, because I have free permission not to engage with the rest of the world and to stay home. I also have the control to set free and to go out there and be one of the people who says, I don't want to adhere to any restrictions. And that spectrum of control is wide, and something that you speak to in your book in particular. And I think that is something that comes up in most good fiction, is how much we control our lives and ourselves and how we conduct our choices, and how much we don't, and we just let it all fly free. When you're writing a story, how much of this idea of my characters have agency or don't have agency do you start with?
Right. Such a good question. It's one I haven't thought of much at all in terms of like my writing as a whole. Like with Meadowlark, obviously there's big themes of control that run throughout the book. But I think that you're right, that I am really interested in basically putting characters in a situation where all control has been taken away from them and they need to react in a way, right? So that they don't have control. And that what do you do when you want control, as we all do, and it's been taken away from you? How do you function in a world like that? It really does. I mean, that comes back to this explosive plot idea in a way, because if this idea of control has been taken from you, you're push as hard as you can to get it back, and that can really build tension as well.
Let's think for a minute about the building blocks of craft in this arena, this idea that we're going to write a story that speaks to the human condition, that speaks to the push and pull between agency and lack of control, that speaks to the idea that we want to steer our own moments of high and low and intensity and relaxation. When you start to tell a story, when you start a new book, you're like, fresh document, day one, here I go, I'm gonna write a book now. I'm sure it starts exactly like that, right? Like, okay, kids, go play in the yard. Okay, husband, go make your own dinner. Okay, whatever professional obligations I have, you tend to yourselves for a moment. I have a brand new, fresh, clean Word document in front of me. I'm gonna tell a story. From the very beginning, what are the essential components of creating a story that will have tension, that will gear itself up to that moment of an explosive plot point that sets in action everything that affects the characters henceforth? What do you do from day one to make sure you are setting in place an explosive plot?
Right. So a semi-unsatisfactory answer is that I don't think you can do it from day one. But I will say,
it's a fair answer.
Right. I will say, though, that I am a big fan of this statement of it doesn't matter how you get the writing done. It matters how you get the writing done, right? Meaning, like, everyone's process is so different, and how you end up with an explosive novel may be very different for me than it is for somebody else. But for me, and actually for a lot of writers I know, that you come at the novel really having no idea what you want to talk about, this or what you're doing. I mean, there's this great Peter book, writing, how do I know what I think until I write it? Something like that. And I definitely agree that the writing process is how I figure out what the book is about. However, I think that usually what happens a lot of times is that you get a quarter of the way through the book, and then I had to pause and be like, okay, I know who these people are. I know what the general story is, but and I think that, and can you hear me? Because they're now telling me like this little thing is like, your speaker is not working. Please check
it was a little funky there for a minute. Now it's better.
Better now?
I think just for the fun of it, why don't you sit a little closer to your microphone just in case that makes a difference. And also try talking a little slower so we can catch the gist even if we missed a little bit.
Hold on. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you loud and clear.
So I think that so once, you pause and you say, okay, I know where the story is going. I know who my people are. What I usually do is sit down and come back to conflict again. But I'm particularly interested in this like inverted check mark kind of form. A lot of times people will say,
wait, go back.
Yeah, to the inverted check mark.
Inverted check mark. What is that interesting thing all about?
So oftentimes in high school, particularly, students will learn about the triangle mode. Like triangle is how a story, that's the shape of the story. Resolution, right? It looks like a triangle. And it's just not really accurate, one, for contemporary fiction pretty much at all, but also just for a lot of different kinds of fiction. And what I think is more interesting, the shape, is this inverted check mark that kind of, I'll draw it for you, like, right? And so it goes, so you have these mini moments.
I thought the arc was like this, like, like you do the building tension, you reach a climax, and then zoop, and you've got the denouement, which is such a fancy, fun word to say out loud. So how is yours fit into that?
So think of that inverted check mark just exactly like what you're saying, Laura. It's an inverted check mark. But I think what's interesting about this model is that along the way, there's these little dips. So you're always moving towards this one explosive moment or this one climactic moment together. Along the way, you have either scenes or moments or chapters where they're almost like small check marks, right? Somebody's trying to get it. Oh, we did it. Someone gets it again. Oh, it's not quite working. Oh, now I've gotten closer. So you have those dips along the way.
Okay, your audio is a little funky, so I think I'm just going to do my best. I don't know what to do. Let me repeat what I think you just said so that everyone can grab it. What you're saying, and tell me if I'm wrong, is that's true, that we're creating a story arc that's going to heighten and heighten and heighten in tension, and then get to that part where it has to crack open, and then we see the aftermath of what falls out afterward. But so far, so good?
Yes, absolutely.
And then along the way, there's stopping points, little mini micro moments where we almost have those intensities dialed up, but in their own space. Right. We stop and we pause on that moment of new intensity. And then we stop and we pause at that new moment of intensity. And your scenes or your anecdotes or your experiential moments for the characters along the way, each one has that like check mark of experience to build to something bigger. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely.
Okay, so say I'm an author, God forbid. I will negotiate your contracts and get you every last bit of money you want, but I am not a craft writer. So I'm in awe of those of you who can do and not sell. But let's say for a minute I decided to put on a writer's hat and I'm going to write a book. And if I'm going to plot that book out ahead of time, what I think you're saying is that plot line that I'm crafting that surely will change and evolve as the book gets written, I need to make sure there's several stops along the way with individual little climaxes. Is that correct?
Exactly. And I'm putting in another mic to see if it'll help at all.
So far, so good.
Yeah, so far.
Oh, that sounds different.
Is that better?
It might be. Let's give it a try.
Let's find out.
Okay, hints. If this is not better, send up a flare. Otherwise, I think this is going to be good.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And it's in a short story, that if the short story is one whole scene, lots of short stories take place over a very small point of time in one whole scene. That would be maybe individual moments between two characters. In a novel, that often takes the place of different scenes or sometimes different chapters. And so each of the scenes or the chapters is building to a micro moment in a way, and then, coming down a little, and then building to another micro moment, and then coming down a little bit.
Great. And when I idolize you as a writer. You do not for me because I don't write. But I'm so curious to hear from you as a reader. Are there books in the marketplace? Are there books that you've read that spoke to you as the kind of tension-driven plots that erupt in an
Right.
explosive moment that maybe you weren't emulating them per se, because every story is a new story, but that inspired you to create something similar for your own readers? What books do you love to read? What excites you to read?
It's funny because I have an answer to this, but it's not an answer that's completely satisfying, because the books that I tend to love the most tend to really kind of walk that line between literary and genre. So like Tana French, Laura Lippman.
That's a nice wide range.
What?
That's a nice wide range.
Right? And those books don't always have that explosive moment, but they do have that tension that builds. Um, so I'm trying to think of books that I know that have that explosion, like at the climax moment where everything comes together. And I'm not coming up with anything.
Well, let's talk about what it means to have an explosive plot versus a non-explosive plot. Does explosive literally mean it has to be like guns or bombs or sex or something very extreme and physical? Or can it be explosive in its storytelling and still interior driven?
Yeah, I think so, but it's harder to do. I mean, there's been a couple of books that have just left me, that have been my favorite books of the last few years. Sigrid Nunez's The Friend.
Ah.
I know. And also Jenny Offel's, what is the first one? Department of Speculation. I mean, those books are not explosive in any way, shape, or form, I don't think. And yet they're incredibly readable and page turning. And I think the reason why is because all those characters are at a moment where something has to change, or they're feeling on the precipice of something major. And so that is what drives those books towards a moment where everything is going to be different. And it's not necessarily the guns and the explosions or the sex or the whatever. So I think it can happen, but it's much harder to do in those quiet books.
Quiet books.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that for a second. This is a little greedy for me, because as somebody who works in the industry, I'm like, I work in publishing now as an agent, previously as an editor, but in both capacities, I was assessing manuscripts.
Right.
My job was to look at these manuscripts, these beautiful stories that people told, and then convince a board, like a boardroom full of humans, that this is worth investing in. And one of the catchphrases we use inside publishing that comes up all the time is this phrase, quiet. It's too quiet. What happens if we put a book into the world and it's too quiet? What if the storyline is a quiet one? And I take that for myself as an industry player, in some extent lowercase p, to mean that when it goes out into the world, it's going to be a little harder to get people's attention, because it doesn't have these big explosions, it doesn't have the gunfights, it doesn't have the car chases. It is more of an inside experience to what we feel and think than the actual external noise. When you write a book, do you hold that in mind, that you don't want your book to be a quiet one, ergo it needs to have a little noise to it? Or do you follow your craft and tell the story that you choose to tell and let it steer you toward a noisy experience or an internal quiet one?
Right. So probably both. But what I find particularly interesting about that question is that when I was done with a draft that I was ready to show my agent, she said, so when we're talking about how to market it and who we're going to approach for editors and that kind of thing, she said, well, it's a quiet book. Really? I'm like, wow, 2 cults and a literal like explosive ending. How is this a quiet book? So, I mean, I kind of feel like all literary fiction gets put into the quiet book.
Well, that brings us back to the original topic, or the original question is literary fiction inherently quiet? And I think that your book proves that it isn't. Again, I don't want to give anything away for the readers here, but in Melanie's book, there are absolutely moments of standoff at gunpoint, and that is not a quiet moment. That's so interesting to me that your agent would say what a quiet story. And I think that comes from this idea that when we write about how we think and feel in a very deep, enriched, language enriched way, the assumption is that there will be a quiet landing in the hearts and minds of readers. No matter how many explosions, physiological or mechanical, one might embed in your story plot, it's still going to come across as somehow quieter. And is that true? I don't know. I think we can pay attention to the craft of language and the high dramatic moments of life.
I agree. And I think that anything that is, literary fiction by default takes place a lot in the interiority and in the internal. And so that is by default going to end up being quiet. But I totally agree. It's completely possible to do both. Should we make sure that nobody has any particular questions?
I'm watching the questions.
Okay, good. I know somebody wanted to know the name of the book.
Yes, and also the name of the books that you mentioned. So there's the Sigrid Nunez book, which I'd love for you to tell people about.
So the Sigrid Nunez book is called The Friend, and it's
brilliant and quiet.
Absolutely brilliant and quiet. And I do not tend to like traditionally quiet novels. So these, both The Friend and Department of Speculation by Jenny Ophel, are
Yes, you guys have it.
But are fantastic, for me, examples of how a more atypical, quiet book can still kind of be explosive if the explosive piece is coming from the character, from internally, in their need to change or in their need to make do something different than they're doing, or the stakes are super high for them.
What's the book that, oh my gosh, my brain cells have just exploded. The book, and it's now a very beautiful TV show series on Hulu.
Little Fires Everywhere? No.
That was also wonderful, but that Little Fires Everywhere literally has fire. Normal People is another book that if you were to look at it from a literary standpoint, it'd be very easy to say this is a quiet book. It's quiet because there's not a lot of noise to it. There are not a lot of big bang crash explosions on an external level. It's all internal, but boy, is it powerful. So this, again, it goes back to this choice of words that you had. Explosion, an explosive plot is not the same thing as a combustible plot. Combustible is I'm right there before the explosive moment and I'm with you. Explosive is it actually erupted and we have to deal with the fallout of that rubble. So when I read something like Normal People or watch the TV show, which is also gorgeous, I do think it's quiet, but quiet in a really palpable, intense, finely honed way, whereas a story like yours has that finely honed intensity that is ratchet and ratchet and ratchet, but you also have the explosion and the fallout on the afterward. Do you think that it's harder for writers to go to that external place and that's why they shy away from it? Or do you think that it's the higher, talk to us a little bit about why a writer might choose to go externally explosive versus internally combustible.
Right. And I think that word combustible works way better for books like The Friend and Department of Speculation. Absolutely. They seem more combustible than explosive. Yeah. And now I'm forgetting exactly what I was going to say about that. But I did see while we were talking this question about interiority and how to make it convincing. Oh, and that comes back to your point, Laura, too, is that how do you create something that is, do writers tend to be more interior than they are exterior, and how do they, and do they focus on the interior more than the exterior, which I think they do. But it's interesting because I think one thing that I see a lot of, especially in writing classes, is despite the fact that writers want to live within their characters and maybe have quieter plots that aren't explosive, because that's a very genre fiction thing to do, they shy away from the interiority as well, because there's the question there, how do you make interiority convincing? And I think it's because writers have been told so much show don't tell, and that they don't understand that
thought and backstory and all this kind of internal processing that can take place in a character is showing. It's even if you have your character talking to themselves through a situation, you are showing us their thoughts. They end up thinking that I need to, have tears streaming down their face and like having them throw letters, into the trash to show that they're having an experience. And it's just not true. So I do think part of that may come from being told to show, not tell.
So interesting. I have one last question that is a completely perfect segue from what you just said. And also what we've been talking about the external and what we try to control and keep internal. I have this really wonderful question here about the tension around the idea of embarrassment and shame and humiliation. Because when we write, we're making choices about what we put on the page for the public, but we have to force things onto the page for the public that maybe the character would want to keep private. Because they're embarrassed, because there's shame involved. When you're writing, how much do you try to dig deep into the psyche of your characters and unearth those bits that if you were that character, who to some extent you probably are because you embody them to put their words on a page, how much do you force them to put their shame and their embarrassment right out there for everybody to read?
So me, a lot. But I'm always, I just am interested in that pushing the boundary and pushing boundaries in general. I mean, I think that like people who know me would agree that I even do that in life. But that's something that's super interesting to me in fiction, is that when someone is being forced to push a boundary that they have always kept static and now see as possibly fluid. And so I'm always interested, and maybe it's because we're so used to living in a society where we don't talk about the things that are shameful and embarrassing and, give us internal trauma, that it's interesting and exciting for me to be able to do that on the page. Just that idea of, do you embody your characters or not? I love that question, actually. And I always come back to this Lori Moore quote, and she says that a writer should be like a cook to a cupboard. So what's in the cupboard isn't necessarily what shows up on the table, right? And I think that that's true too. Writers, they have all this stuff inside, but you don't literally take the stuff from inside and throw it on the book, right? You're taking it and crafting it into a meal. And so, there's that idea of
a meal. I love that as a meal.
Right?
What a beautiful way to put it, because a meal is such an everyday intake.
Right?
What a metaphor. I didn't mean to cut you off, though. Did you have something else to say?
No.
That was beautiful. One of the things that I keep thinking about as you're talking about this is, and I can't help that as an industry person, I'm always thinking about what sells. And I don't mean that in terms of what sells, can I make a lot of money, which would be lovely too. Both of me, we want all the money. Let's, let's make it rain, baby. But what I'm also thinking about is this idea of, as writers, how much do we put our eye on what we want to say, and how much do we put our eye on what's going to sell, and how do we bring those two ideas together? I know a lot of writers who just want to let their craft flow, and God bless them. And I know a lot of people have their eye on, how can I sell a big book, and God bless them. But the only way to actually meet the marketplace is to bring them both together. And so when, as an industry assessor of projects, meaning I look at manuscripts and then I talk to a room full of people about what we should invest in financially to promote a book and put a book into the world or not, I think a lot about what is at the core of every single book that is viable in the marketplace today. And the core of that, and I want you to talk to us about this in the last few minutes here, is viability of the ideas of the book and how they reach us. Let me rephrase that a little bit. What is relevant? So for those of you who don't know this, essentially how it works is authors work with agents to pitch editors who pitch boardrooms of people and say, let's invest in this book and offer them a contract and put the book into the world. And the books that get put into the world are the ones that speak to something that will resonate with readers as truthful. And it doesn't matter if it's a fantastical book and highly metaphorical, or if it's very reality based. Either way, the books that we're looking for are the ones that are going to tell a reader, I see you, I hear you, and I can speak to what you're experiencing in your world, even if I'm doing it through my own characters and my own setting. When you write your book, how much do you think about letting your ideas land with your readers as, oh, that's totally me. I never lived in a commune or a cult. I never have laid eyes upon a gun in my life. I'm not a photographer. I do not have a child with synesthesia, which is a really beautiful component of your book, that there's a gorgeous child character who has synesthesia. None of what happens in your book actually have I experienced, right. But all of it hits me on a level of, oh, thank you for seeing and hearing me. Right. That is a book that not only as a reader I respond to and connect with, but as an industry person, as an agent, as an editor, that's what I'm looking for all the time. How did you reach me and let me feel seen and heard? Was that part of your plan?
I mean, yes and no. Because so the no part is that, I went where the book took me. And it's been fascinating actually to see like the critics or people who interview me, to see the things that I knew were kind of brewing in there, but to pinpoint them so perfectly. And I think that I've always been interested in this idea of childhood trauma and how childhood trauma affects the grown-ups that we become. And we all, whether it's like trauma, like severe trauma, or, mini traumas as children, grow up to be affected by the things that happen to us as children. And so I think that is something I really, really pushed in this book, and something that is applicable to everyone. Also this idea of what you're saying about seeing and being seen is something else that I think we all can feel. We all want to be seen. We all want to be seen for who we are and appreciated and loved for who we are. So that element, was dear to my heart. And so it's happy making to see that it comes out with readers as well. So that I think that's what you hope for. And you have some idea that you're doing that, but mostly you just have to hope that it's going to land.
Right. Or have the trust in your inner creative muse that you're speaking to, that what you're writing about isn't just about your own need to say something. It's also about some imagined, envisioned, fantasized audience that it's going to be meaningful to. They have to have the reader experience in mind. That does not mean that you have to somehow calibrate your characters and scenery and plot lines to what others might experience in their own worlds. It means you have to calibrate them to what people will respond to as influential and meaningful, and trust that your reader can translate the plots and themes and stories and characters of your story into something that will be meaningful to them. Looks like yours, even though I've never experienced a single thing in it, speaks to me as, oh, yes, I have that resonates with me as a mother. It resonates with me as a woman. It resonates with me as a member of society that has to choose every day, how much am I going to lean into my own inclinations? How much am I going to adhere to what the conflicts of loyalty to myself and others are?
Yeah.
That's a beautiful book right there. If you can speak to what we're all experiencing without even knowing who we are before we read your book. Wow. And you did it. So I feel like we should all applaud you. That is a big undertaking.
Thank you.
Thank you for setting this up. We're so grateful.
Thank you. Thanks for chatting.